about asynchronicity because we received some questions about why we need to use callback functions in the first place. Cool. So let's go here, go.614.io/workshop1, and let's just clone that repository. I'll give you guys a few minutes. Raise your hand if you need a little more time. Okay. Raise your hand if you still need a little more time. Okay. 1 minute. All right, cool. Let's just continue. So here's a brief overview of the 4 files that you will need to do this workshop. Index.html is going to be the pages for our stories, or the page for our stories. You should basically have created this with Rupine yesterday, so nothing in here should look new. We're only going to need one piece from index.html, and that is, well, if you look inside of it, that is the div with an ID of stories. And that is basically where we'll be putting all of our stories today, or stories and comments. API.js is actually something that we give to you for free. It is a JavaScript file that contains methods that allows you to make GET and POST requests. Theme.js is where we will be doing the bulk of our programming today. I provided a bit of an outline for you that contains some information, but basically it'll contain like methods that will actually call actually make API requests to a server that I set up for you guys, and creates HTML elements for stories and comments and adds them to the stories div inside of index.html. Finally, we need to update index.js in order to call our new JavaScript methods from feed.js in order to actually render the stories page. Okay, so the overview's out of the way. Let's take a look at this slide. It's important to understand the tools that we're using. And I'll give an example, or I guess a hypothetical example. So let's say that as a student of this class, when you start coding your web application, you go home and you decide to use Bootstrap. I mean, why not? I mean, Rupine did a great job of teaching it, so you may as well use it. Now, let's say that you are also a lazy student, and you kind of have a basic understanding of how Bootstrap works. So you go ahead and you add a bunch of Bootstrap classes to your code, but you're too lazy to read the documentation for the code. Now, you don't really care, so you just keep adding more and more classes. This might work for the first 1 or 2 or 3 or maybe even 100 classes that you add to your project. However, I guarantee you that at some point, you're going to refresh your page and your website is going to break. Maybe something that you recently added was incompatible with something that you did 40 changes ago, but you really need this new thing to work. In that case, you're basically screwed, right? Because you didn't take the time to understand how Bootstrap worked, so there's no way that you'll be able to start debugging it. And you'll be a very sad person. In this course, you'll probably try to use a lot of external tools to build your web applications, and I highly encourage that you try to get a decent understanding of how your tools actually work before you use them. Because a lot of tools may have intricacies that you may not understand the first time around. Cool, so to that end, our first exercise for today will be to take a look at API.js. So just take a few minutes, try to see if you can answer these 4 questions, and we will go through them at the end of the few minutes. You don't have to know what every single line of code in there does, just enough to answer these questions. Raise your hand if you need more time. Okay. A few more minutes. Okay, let's go over these questions. So number one, what parameters do the get and post methods take? Anyone? Yeah.
A URL, a variable called params, which encodes the format, and then two functions, one that's called when there's a success and one that's called when it's a failure.
Okay, cool. So let's take a look at API.js. Can everyone see? Make it a little bigger. Okay. So yeah, the get and post requests both take the same parameters. They take an endpoint, which again is a URL. It's the endpoint that you're going to be making the request to. It takes a parameter called params. This is basically the data that you'll be sending along with your HTTP request. So for example, again, if you're logging in to an account, params would contain information such as your username and your password. It also contains two functions called success callback and failure callback, which we'll get into in a little bit. Okay, question two. How are requests actually made? I want to know what object is used.
Yeah?
Using
Yeah, we're using an object called XML HTTP request. You can see that on lines 13 and 34. XHR is basically just an instance of this object. What XML HTTP request is it's basically a tool that's provided by your browser that helps you make the requests. Simple enough? Okay. Maybe someone can answer both of these questions at the same time. What happens when a request returns with a success, and what happens when it returns with an error? Yeah.
If it returns with a success, you're just going to call your success callback function, and otherwise you'll call your failure callback.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. So on lines 18 to 20 and 40 to 42, you can see that XHR checks the status of the response, and if it's a success, then it'll call a success callback function. Otherwise, it'll call a failure callback function. So there's two main points that I want to bring attention to in these few lines. The first is this line right here, if success callback. This line is basically checking to see if your success callback function exists. And similarly, in line 22, this line is checking whether or not your failure callback function actually exists. So the reason why JavaScript does that, if you're unfamiliar with it, is because when you pass in parameters to functions in JavaScript, you don't actually have to supply all of your parameters. For example, I could call the get method with only an endpoint, with only the endpoint parameters and with only the params parameters. And the parameters that I don't pass in will just be passed in as undefined. So that's why these checks exist. Cool. The second thing is that you might notice that get and post don't actually do any computation. They don't actually process the response for you, and they don't return anything. All they do is they make a request for you, and they just pass in the response they get into a function that you provide. So if you actually want to process the response that you get from making an API request, you'll have to write code by yourself to process that, put it into a function, and put it into one of these callback functions when you make the request. Does that make sense? If there are any questions, now is the time to ask. Cool. Nice. So for this workshop, we basically provided you for free with methods to make and post requests. These work with pure JavaScript, so no frameworks. If you ever need to make HTTP requests when you're building web applications, you can take this code and feel free to use it. One thing to note is that in production, a lot of services will actually use a bunch of frameworks, so they won't just use pure JavaScript. And a lot of these frameworks will have their own methods for making API requests. But I won't get too much into that. Okay, cool. So now that we have a better understanding, hopefully, of how API.js works, we also have to understand how our API works. What this means is we have to know what endpoints we're working with, we have to know what kind of data we need to send to each endpoint in order to make the request, and we need to know what kind of format the responses come in so we can work with them. So I said to you guys before that I provided you guys with a server. You don't have to memorize this. All this information is at the top of feed.js. But I will basically just be taking you through our API and what it does. So it is located at this URL, which I will visit. And it's basically Catbook, right? So we have two endpoints for our API that you will need to use today. The first is /API/stories, and the second one is /API/comment. One of them retrieves all of the stories in our database, and the other retrieves all of the comments for a specific story. So let's just see what this looks like. I'm going to be making the requests in the Chrome inspector. And I can do this because API.js is provided within the service. Okay. So I'm going to first make a GET request in order to fetch all the stories in our database. So I'm just going to be using the GET method in API.js. So can I make this bigger? Whoa, okay. Can everyone see that? Cool. So I'm going to call GET. And again, the first parameter is our endpoint, right? So the endpoint starts with this URL. And the endpoint for getting the stories is, again, /API/stories. Splatters. The second parameter is params. It's basically the data that we want to pass along with our HTTP request. In the case of this endpoint, /API/stories, we don't actually need to provide any additional data in order to get the information that we want. And so, we're just going to pass in an empty JavaScript object. Let's make this bigger. Cool. So the third parameter is our success callback function. So I'm just going to define an anonymous function. Let's have the response get passed in as the stories variable. Oh, if you're following along with me, the inspector is kind of weird. So if you want to move to a new line, you don't want to press enter. Enter will actually just go ahead and evaluate whatever you've typed. If you want to go to a new line, you actually want to hold shift and then press enter. Cool. So let's close that. Why is that cut off? That's weird. Okay, can everyone see that? I don't know how it's getting cut off. And let's just print our responses. So console.log stories. And again, I'm not providing the fourth parameter, which is the failure callback, because I'm fairly confident that this will work. But in practice, when you're writing your web applications, you should provide a failure callback function so that you can print out whatever errors you may get, so you can so it can help you debug whatever errors you're having. Cool. So I'm going to hit enter. I don't really know what the first undefined is about. Let's just ignore it. But the second one is all of our stories. So it looks kind of scary, but let's break it down. So the response that we received is basically just an array, you can see the square brackets here, of JavaScript objects. And each of these objects represents a story. So let's just take a look at one of them. I'm going to pick one that I know has comments so that we can later get the comments of that story. So I'm going to pick comment number 13.
And before Danny goes ahead, is everyone who wants to follow along at that point, just before you get lost?
Oh yeah, I can wait a little bit. Huh? Scroll up. Yeah. Oh, this is actually how you're going to make the actual GET request to the API, so you might want to keep this in mind for later.
Probably just wait a minute or two so everyone can write this down or get to that point. But then you could just, if you're following along, you can just if you are at that point. Also, one last thing, you guys don't have to navigate to the URL as well. You just can open up.
You do have to navigate to the
Oh, you do
URL.
have to?
Yeah, because you need API.js, which is loaded in this page. Time-wise. Okay, cool. So again, I've selected story number 13 because I know that it has comments. And we will just copy this into our text editor, and I will format this so that it looks a little bit more nice. Get is not defined. Are you on this URL? Are you at this URL? Yes. sorry, I didn't make a URL shortener for this. Oh, it's also at the top of your feed.js file, if you just want to copy and paste it.
Can you scroll up again?
Let's scroll again. Yeah, I got you. What's up?
Wait, sorry, I can't see which file you got it.
Feed.js. It's in the JavaScript directory. It's in the JS folder, and then, yeah, actually. So, it's in Catbook -workshop 1. It's in JS, and then it's here, feed.js. And it's at the top here. We should stay here. Okay, let's just take a look at this. So this is one of the stories in the array that we return. I'm going to get rid of some extra fields that we don't need for this workshop. This one and this one. Okay, cool. Oh, crap. So this is all of the information that you need, at least for the stories for this workshop. So let's take a look. So the story object has an underscore ID field. This is just an alphanumeric string that the database uses to keep track of the story. It has a creator name, which is Danny Tang because I wrote the story, and it has the content of the story. So I don't have any cats now, but this website has inspired me to adopt 10. Now, let's actually get the comments from this story. And then we can compare what the story object and what the comment objects look like. So, to do this, we're going to use the other endpoint, which is /API/comment. And we're going to do this in basically the same fashion. So we're going to make a call using the get method. Again, the first parameter is the endpoint. And it's going to be /API/comment, not comment, it's not plural. And this actually requires you to put in a parameter. So in order for you to fetch all of the comments for a given story, you actually need to pass it the ID of the story. So that's this. And you're going to pass it under the parents field, because all the comments belong to the story. So the story is like the comment's parent. Cool. Boom. And we're going to write a success callback function again. So we'll take the comments. What did I do? And again, we're just going to log them. So you get a pretty similar response. Again, it's basically just an array of objects, of JavaScript objects, and each of these represents or corresponds to one of the comments. Let's take a look at this one. I'll format it again. Cool. So this is what an object from our comments looks like. Let's go through it. You can see that it's pretty similar to the one for a story. So this is for a story. This is for a comment. So the comment a comment also has an ID. It's, again, how the database keeps track of this specific comment. It also has a creator name. In this case, it's Rupayan because he made a comment on my story. And the content, or the text, is, I think a good name is Wednesday. Cool. So the one thing that a comment object has that the story object does not have is this parent field. And the parent field is basically how you're going to link together a comment and a story. So the parent field of a comment tells you what story that comment belongs to. So you can see here that the value of parent is actually the same as the value of the ID of the story for that comment. Does that make sense? That's how we link the two together. Okay, so you may be wondering, why have we set it up like this? Why do we have two separate objects for a story and for a comment? I mean, you could just do something like this, where you just include an extra field inside of your story object and just make that an array of all of your comments. So comments here. One reason is that it is in general a pretty good coding practice to separate out code wherever it makes sense. So a story and a comment are both pretty concrete concepts, and it makes sense to me at least to have two separate things representing them. Maybe a more practical reason would be, let's say in the future, when we want to develop Catbook even further, let's say we want to, sorry, let me just put this back here. Let's say we want to add functionality in order to make edits to our comments. So for all our comments on this page, there will be like an edit button on the side that we can click to edit the comment. Well, if we had a structure like this, where we include the comments in the story, in order to fetch the comments, to edit them, we would actually have to first make a call to retrieve all of the stories, right? So we would first get all the stories, then we would have to find the specific story that the comment belongs to, and then finally, we would have to go into all of the comments and find the correct comment. And basically what that ends up being is a lot of wasted work. It doesn't really make sense for you to have to iterate through all of the stories if you want to edit a comment. So we don't do that. Instead, we have two separate objects so that if you want to add this functionality in the future, you can instead just find the comment right away using its ID. Does that make sense? That's why we have two separate objects for a story and a comment. Okay, cool. So hopefully now you have an understanding of how our API works, the two endpoints, how to make requests to them, and what the responses for them look like. Now we're going to go to that aside that I talked about earlier. So why do we use callback functions? It's a pretty simple answer. The answer being that JavaScript is an asynchronous programming language. If you don't know what that means, it's a pretty fancy, big word. How I like to think of it is, in an asynchronous programming language, when you run, such as JavaScript, say when you run a JavaScript file, one line of code will not wait for a previous line of code to finish before it itself runs. And this is a problem for us when we want to do things like make API requests, because they take a long time to finish, at least relative to the other lines of code. So I'll just show you an example of that here. Let's clear the console. Let's say I have a variable, let's call it x. And I want to make an API request to get all the stories. And in my callback function, I just want to set x to be equal to stories. So on the first try, so in the end, I want to print out x. On the first try, I'm going to put x down here. what do you think this will print out? All the stories? Huh? Nothing. Undefined. Yeah. So if I press enter, it will actually print out undefined. And the reason for this, again, is because JavaScript is asynchronous. So one line of code does not wait for another to finish running before it itself runs. So let's just go through this line by line, right? Let's say I'm an interpreter for JavaScript. And I'm at the top line, let x. So that's just a declaration of variable. Cool, I move on. And the second line is the get request. So that's when I start making the yes. Yeah, I tried to do that earlier, but some of the text got cut off. I don't know why. Cool. So after let x, I move on to make the call to my API, right? So that's this get call right here. Unfortunately for us, again, HTTP requests generally take longer to complete than other lines of code. So even before this request is finished running, my interpreter will move on to the next line. So it'll go on to console.logx. So at this point, because my API request never finished running, it never had time to go into this function here and set x equal to stories. And because of this, when I print x, it's just undefined. Oh, again, ignore the first undefined. I don't really know why that's there. Does that make sense? So it gets to console.log before we can actually set x equals stories in the callback function because the API request took longer to run. So let's try that again, but let's actually make it work. Yeah, so this gets cut off a little bit. So let's have a new variable, y. And this time we're going to be a bit smarter. So we're actually going to log y inside of our callback function. And what do you think will happen when I hit enter? Try to someone normal it. If I press enter, it'll actually display all of the stories. And that's because we put it inside of the callback function that we passed the API request. That is only run by the get method after the API request is completed. Does that make sense? So whenever you're making these API requests and you want to actually do something to process the responses that you get, you're going to want to make sure that you write that code inside of a callback function that you pass to it. Otherwise, you're just going to get undefined all over the place and you're going to have a bad time. Okay. You can actually also have nested callback functions. So let's say I wanted to make a get request inside of this, inside of the callback function for this get request.